Before the dust had settled on Celtic's disastrous European Cup final defeat to Feyenoord on the 6th of May 1970, a very short and very significant piece appeared in the Evening Times. Malcolm Munro was something of a confidant of Jock Stein's, and on the 7th of May, almost unnoticed amidst the fallout and recriminations from the previous evening, he wrote, "Experienced players in the team will probably have to go. Certainly Celtic are good enough to win the domestic cups again, but that's not what Stein has in mind. Once you've tasted the big stuff, nothing else will do." The Lisbon Lions couldn't go on forever. Time and tide wait for no man, and the day was always bound to come when they would all have left the club. But to this day, many continue to insist they were gone too soon. By the end of 1971, a significant number had gone. It's important to note here that the definition of Lisbon Lions has changed over the years. In 1971, the Lisbon Lions were regarded as the 11 players who had faced Inter Milan on the 25th of May 1967. By this definition, even John Fallon, who as a goalkeeper was the only substitute permitted by the rules of the time, is not included. On the 25th of May 1987, a Scott Sports special was aired on STV, reuniting the Lions for the 20th anniversary of their triumph. Only the 11 who played in Lisbon were included, and they sat around a table reliving their memories of the day under a portrait of Jock Stein, who had so tragically died in September 1985 at the end of a World Cup qualifier against Wales at Ninian Park. Over the next few years, a consensus developed that limiting the Lions to the 11 who played in Lisbon was unfair on those players who had played and made huge contributions in earlier rounds of the tournament, and players such as Fallon, John Hughes, Joe McBride, Willie O'Neill and Charlie Gallagher also became recognised as being members of this legendary group. McBride and O'Neill were both sold long before Milan, and in the very week that the final took place, almost unnoticed, Charlie Gallagher was given a free transfer and joined Dumbarton. None of them were recognised as Lisbon Lions at the time, but they certainly have been regarded as such since the years following the 20th anniversary of the European Cup triumph. The breakup of the 11 who actually played in Lisbon began in the week of the European Cup final in Milan, when Ronnie Simpson announced his retirement at the age of 39. Known as Father to his teammates, he made his first appearance at Celtic Park as a 15-year-old while playing for Queen's Park during World War II, while many of his Lisbon teammates were still in their prams. In 1948, while still an amateur with the Spiders, he played for Great Britain in the football tournament at the first Olympic Games of the post-war era in London. His long career saw him earn the distinction of being the youngest player ever to play in a top-flight match in Scotland, and also the oldest player ever to make his debut for Scotland when he was capped against England in April 1967 at the age of 36. Simpson suffered a dislocated shoulder in a Scottish Cup tie against Clyde at Shawfield in February 1969, and after attempting a comeback in October 1969, dislocated the same shoulder again in the League Cup semi-final against Ayr United at Hampden. By May 1970, he was forced to acknowledge that the shoulder would never again be able to withstand the rigours of professional football, and called time on an incredible career that included 2 FA Cup winners' medals with Newcastle United in the 1950s to go along with his glittering Celtic trophy haul. Such was Jock Stein's control over the Scottish media at the height of his powers in 1970, that Malcolm Munro's prediction would never have appeared without his knowledge, never mind his consent. Despite this, the remaining Lisbon Lions would see out season 1970-71 before the departures began in earnest. And while for some of those who were moved on by December 1971 the time was probably right, some would go who surely still had a lot to offer, and had they still been around for another few seasons, might well have seen Celtic into a third European Cup final. The League Championship of season 1970-71 was a landmark in Celtic's history in more ways than one, and while it was won in large part by players who had been part of the first team squad in 1967, it was unmistakably a season of change. On the field, Celtic had to fend off a fierce title challenge from Eddie Turnbull's Aberdeen, who had beaten them 3-1 in the 1970 Scottish Cup final. The Dons had finished in mid-table in season 1969-70, but their Scottish Cup win proved a springboard for a campaign in which they took the title down to the wire in 1970-71. Their 1-0 win at Celtic Park on the 12th of December 1970 saw them leapfrog Celtic to the top of the league, and they would stay there until the end of April, with a defence that established a British record of 12 consecutive clean sheets between October and January. Following the December defeat to Aberdeen, their third loss to the Dons that calendar year, and a traumatic beginning to 1971 with the tragedy at Ibrox on January the 2nd, Celtic's season was kick-started by an 8-1 win at Dens Park on the 16th of January. On the same day, Aberdeen's 15-match winning streak was ended by a 2-1 defeat at Easter Road, Pat Stanton opening the scoring to breach Aberdeen's defence for the first time in 3 months. Celtic and Aberdeen remained nip and tuck into April, and the decisive match took place at Pittodrie on the 17th of April 1971, a 1-1 draw leaving Celtic 1 point behind, but with 3 matches left to play, while Aberdeen had only 1. Aberdeen crashed to defeat to Falkirk in their final match, while Celtic took the title with a draw against St Mirren and a 2-0 win over Ayr United in their next 2 matches, after which Jock Stein announced the Lions would play together for the final time in the final league match of the season against Clyde on the 1st of May 1971. The manager was quoted in the Daily Record of the 30th of April 1971. "We will never have another chance to see this great Lisbon side together again. They are breaking up now. I'm not saying that some of them won't play on for a long time, but there can never again be a chance to see them together on a football park." With a touch of sentimentality, he concluded, "I don't suppose our record-equalling performance will ever be done again. The Lisbon game was the pinnacle of these 6 great years for the club. You could now say we are heading into something new, but I would like to take time to remember a great side." The gutted main stand at Celtic Park, undergoing significant renovation, provided a symbolically apt background for an emotion-packed day when the Lions roared for the final time. Ronnie Simpson had already been retired for 12 months and was not able to play in the match, but he came out with the team for the pre-match warm-up and then led them out for kick-off before being replaced by Evan Williams. One player who wasn't so happy with this arrangement was John Fallon, who had been the substitute goalkeeper in Lisbon. It perhaps didn't even occur to Stein to play Fallon in this match, so ingrained were the names of the 11 who played in the Estadio Nacional. Fallon writes in his autobiography, Keeping in Paradise, I had to sit and watch Ronnie Simpson come out with the team. He couldn't play because he had now officially retired and was no longer registered, so he had to withdraw before the game began and was replaced, not by me, but by Evan Williams. I was less than happy about that, for I had been the substitute goalkeeper. As a farewell for the Lions, it could not have been better scripted. The 6th successive league championship was in the bag, the atmosphere was carnival-like, the sun was shining on paradise, and the fabled outfield 10 turned on the style for one last time. Even Clyde played their part, applauding the Lions onto the pitch and attempting to play an open and entertaining game. The Glasgow Herald of the 3rd of May 1971 reported, "Even the sun shone brightly in simulated tribute at Parkhead for the return of Celtic's European Cup Masters of 1967, writes Jim Parkinson. It was as though no time at all had elapsed since their unforgettable Lisbon match 4 years ago. The reunion of this great side was incredibly emotional and sentimental. They took the field from among the rubble, where the club's new stand is being rebuilt, to a fantastic acclamation from the 35,000 shirt-sleeved crowd. They left the field carrying Bertie Auld, who has been freed by the club, aloft to a staggeringly rapturous ovation. In between these two peak decibel moments, the players relived and recreated the attacking, stylish football for which they will always be renowned. Perhaps they were a little slower, but they were just as devastating. It was a delightful, wonderful occasion. All that were needed to add the final touch of gala day atmosphere were bags of buns, bottles of pop, and sack races for the youngsters. The years were rolled back as Clyde were torn apart by some scintillating exhibition football. 3 goals from Bobby Lennox, who would, apart from a brief American interlude in 1978, remain in the first team into the 1980s, and 2 from Willie Wallace, seeing Celtic into a 5-1 lead early in the second half. Aptly, the final goal was scored by Steve Chalmers, who of course had scored the late winner in Lisbon. Chalmers is quoted in the Celtic Wiki website report on the match. "We were 5-1 ahead and the game was coursing towards its conclusion when Tommy McCulloch, the Clyde goalkeeper, saved my shot from inside the 6-yard box but failed to gather the ball. I followed up to put the rebound into the net. It was surely fitting that the scorer of the winner in Lisbon should also net the final goal for the Lions. I had scored in what proved to be my final league match for Celtic, even if I did not know it at the time." It's a shame that neither Chalmers nor John Clark had been told beforehand that this would be their final Celtic appearance. It had already been announced that Bertie Auld had been freed, and he was given a raucous send-off by the fans while being carried shoulder-high by his teammates around the pitch. It allowed the fans to show their appreciation of a club legend in a fitting personal farewell, while Clark and Chalmers might have felt there would be another day for them to say their goodbyes. As the Lions took their final bows and fans began to drift away fully 30 minutes after the final whistle, Jock Stein's mind was already turning to the Scottish Cup final against Rangers 7 days later, and Celtic's line-up for this gives us an inkling of how Stein saw the short-term future of his team at least. Out went Tommy Gemmell, suggesting he had fallen out of favour with the manager, Jim Brogan taking his position at left-back as he had many times that season, and in came George Connolly for his 3rd Scottish Cup final appearance in a row, and Davy Hay for his 2nd final. Hay had played most of his breakthrough season at right-back, but this term he had increasingly been deployed in midfield, with Danny McGrain making a series of impressive performances at right-back in the first half of the season before the restoration of Jim Craig from December onwards. Also back in the team were Harry Hood and Tom Callaghan, while Willie Wallace remained as the main striker. Another significant omission from the team was Bobby Murdoch, who had missed much of the second half of the season through injury. Questions were already being asked about his long-term future. The Scottish Cup final of 1971 turned out to be a pivotal moment in the careers of 2 Celtic strikers at opposite ends of their careers. On the bench was Lou Macari, who had been threatening to make the breakthrough for some time. The team was announced the day before, the Glasgow Herald reporting on the 7th of May 1971. "Lou Macari, who recently asked for a transfer, has been named as 12th man. He is a quicksilver, opportunist type of attacker, and his selection as substitute obviously points significantly to the tactics the Parkhead side have in mind. It's an intriguing aside by the Herald, but nothing in any of the other newspapers of the time indicates that Macari had asked for a transfer. Whether he had or not, Macari was firmly in Jock Stein's plans and would have a bigger part to play before the week was out. The final proved a frustrating day for heavy favourites Celtic, who were well below par in the first half, as Rangers, who had finished a league campaign well off the pace, had played surprisingly well and should have been ahead before the interval. The Glasgow Herald reported on the 10th of May 1971, Rangers claim this season that they are a side more suitably geared to the rigours of cup football does not sound nearly so extravagant now, writes Jim Parkinson. With a great sense of occasion, they lifted their game to the heights again before 120,092 spectators in the Scottish Cup final at Hampden. And although it required a remarkable goal by their 17-year-old substitute Derek Johnston 4 minutes from the end to keep them in contention, a replay on Wednesday night was no less than they deserved. Despite all Rangers' first half pressure, it was Celtic who went in ahead at half-time, the Herald reporting, "Then, with basic simplicity, Celtic scored in 40 minutes. The ball was played from their own goal, hooked on by Wallace to Hood, and he slanted the ball through to Lennox, who moved past Miller and shot into the far corner of the net. It seemed incredible, as Celtic's only other worthwhile contribution in attack had been a fiery shot from Hood, which McCloy saved early in the game." Lennox's goal changed the course of the game, the Glasgow Herald continuing, "The goal transformed Celtic. They became more sophisticated, whereas Rangers lost their earlier poise and became over-hurried in their attempts to move the ball downfield. Jimmy Johnston began to show his trickery, and Lennox's speed caused more anxiety for Rangers on the other flank." For long periods of the second half, it looked like Celtic were cruising to victory. But just as Celtic had scored at the end of a half dominated by Rangers, their rivals would snatch a shock equaliser in the dying minutes when Derek Johnston capitalised on a defensive mix-up between Evan Williams and George Connolly to take the final to a replay. Jock Stein was not best pleased with the result, Lou Macari telling Archie McPherson for Jock Stein, the definitive biography, "I can remember Jock was angry at the way the goal had been conceded in the last minute. We left Hampden and went straight to Seamill Hydro again, where the manager was not in the best of moods and the training we undertook was heavy. I think he was annoyed that there might have been an element of complacency creeping in." The 21-year-old Macari was about to become a beneficiary of Stein's annoyance, and it was Willie Wallace who would bear the brunt of his displeasure over the cup final performance. Malcolm Munro wrote in the Evening Times of Monday the 10th of May 1971, "Celtic never got going until they had a glory spell in the second half when Jimmy Johnston got the feel of the ball. Callaghan did some good running off the ball and so did Lennox, but Wallace was subdued by McKinnon and that's why the Celts didn't tick. Wallace has had better games and I dare say he knows it himself." Wallace found himself on the bench for the replay, with Macari joining George Connolly and Davy Hay in a line-up that included only 4 men who had played in Lisbon: Jim Craig, Billy McNeil, Jimmy Johnston and Bobby Lennox. His selection came as a great surprise to Macari, who told Archie McPherson, "Of course I didn't think I was playing, and since this was my first final and I was a surprise selection, people used to ask me how Jock had built me up for it. He didn't. I just sat there in the dressing room as usual, thinking I would be on the bench again. But when he read out the team, I was in it. And that was that. Nothing special was said to me, no instructions in depth. I knew what I had to do, and I went out and did it." Macari did it in some style. Jim Parkinson reporting in the Glasgow Herald of the 13th of May 1971. "Lou Macari and Jimmy Johnston held the key to Celtic's 21st Cup success. It was largely through their sharpness and trickery that Celtic established command before the interval." Macari was in the right place at the right time on 24 minutes when a low-driven Bobby Lennox corner kick flew right through everyone crowded at the near post, and he had the simple task of side-footing it into the net. 2 minutes later, as Jimmy Johnston was sent clear by a pass on the edge of the box from Tom Callaghan, Ronnie McKinnon brought him down with what amounted to a rugby tackle, and Harry Hood sent Peter McCloy the wrong way from the penalty spot.
He's a penalty, McKinnon. Well, there's good spirit. Well, it's Harry Hood who's taking this penalty kick. Placing it carefully. There he is, coming back. And then it's 2-0 for Celtic.
There was a nervy end to the match when Celtic again conceded a late goal, Jim Craig turning an awkwardly bouncing ball into his own net as he attempted to clear from the goal line. But no one could deny they were well worth the win. Archie Macpherson related a conversation with Jock Stein at full time in Jock Stein, the definitive biography. Stein's delight at Macari's selection coming up roses for both of them that day was evident when in the pitchside interview with me afterwards he took pleasure in saying, "That was a good result for Rangers." "But it was you who won," I replied, slightly nonplussed by his remark. "Aye," he said, "but it could have been a lot worse for them." Game, set and match to the man who limped off again with a relaxed smile on his face, as if he still could not deal with the BBC without some little sting in the tail. 1 year on from the disaster in Milan, Jock Stein was entitled to feel relatively satisfied with the season just gone. Neither the League nor the Scottish Cup had been won easily, but nevertheless the ship had been steadied, the double secured, and it had been no disgrace to be eliminated from the European Cup at the quarter-final stage by the eventual winners Ajax, although it would be the 2nd of June before they defeated Panathinaikos in the final. It was the third season in a row in which Celtic had only lost to the winners of the tournament. The league had been secured mostly by the experienced men in the squad, but the clock was ticking down on several Celtic careers, and 2 days later, a testimonial match at Rugby Park for Kilmarnock's Frank Beattie might well have set in motion the beginning of the end for two in particular. Tommy Gemmell had played in only one first-team match since the 10th of April, the Lisbon Lions' last appearance, but he was on standby for the testimonial and made a fateful decision that day that might just have sealed his fate. Gemmell remembered in his biography, Lionheart, written with Graham McCall, "I was supposed to be on standby to play, but I was on the golf course at Dullator with Willie Wallace on the day of the game. Jock phoned the clubhouse where we were having a couple of pints. Bill Rankin, the club master, came looking for us and we told him to say that we were still out on the course. It was only after that game at Kilmarnock that Jock started to play Kenny up front. There was no looking back after that. If Willie Wallace had gone down for the game, Jock might not have played Kenny up front that day, but Kenny would still have made his breakthrough in style at some point." Gemmell's memory must have been playing tricks on him when his biography was written over 30 years later, because Willie Wallace did play against Kilmarnock that day. Gemmell, though, was not there, and if he missed the game because he was playing golf, we can only wonder what Jock Stein must have made of it. He had already made it clear that some of his established stars would be moving on, and it can't have helped Gemmell convince his manager that he had a long-term future at the club if he was unable to play against Kilmarnock because he was on the golf course. The day of Frank Beattie's testimonial also saw the relationship between Stein and John Hughes reach something of a breaking point. Hughes played in the Scottish Cup semi-final against Ergionians on the 3rd of April, a 3-3 draw, and had been dropped for the replay. He had not featured in the first team since and was increasingly unhappy. He told Archie Macpherson for Jock Stein, the definitive biography, "I couldn't even get a game for the reserves. I would turn up for a reserve match and I would discover I wasn't even playing in that and I had to sit in the stand and suffer. You can imagine how that feels for someone who has given great service to the club. It was a bit undignified to say the least. I had asked for a transfer. Well, one night I reported to Celtic Park for a reserve game and lo and behold I wasn't picked again. I couldn't suffer it any longer. I just walked out to the car, jumped in it and went home. I didn't regard that as serious, as after all I wasn't playing." That, though, was reported back to Jock. A few days later, I got a call from the club asking me to report for a game against Kilmarnock in the Frank Beattie testimonial down at Rugby Park. I was surprised by this, for I knew I was right out of favour, but I was told to turn up for the team bus. When we got into the dressing room, he read out the team and I wasn't in it. I wasn't even to strip at all. He turned to me in front of everybody and said, "And how are you going to get home from here? You don't have your car with you." He deliberately humiliated me. Gemmell, Wallace and Hughes would all be sold by the end of the year, and in the case of Gemmell and Hughes, it's difficult to argue that their strained relationships with the manager had nothing to do with it. As Gemmell alluded to, the Frank Beattie testimonial saw the breathtaking emergence of Kenny Dalglish onto the scene. He would become the jewel in Celtic's crown before very much longer, but up to this point, just how good he could become had not been widely recognised, and most of his appearances had been in midfield. This all changed at Rugby Park. Kilmarnock had several guest players in for the occasion, including Colin Stein and Willie Johnston of Rangers, but they could do nothing to stop Dalglish. The Glasgow Herald reported on the 15th of May 1971, "Frank Beattie's testimonial game at Rugby Park last night was turned into a gala occasion for Ken Dalglish, Celtic's young centre-forward," writes Jim Parkinson. "He stole the thunder with a spectacular 6-goal performance." Another player who did his career prospects no harm that night was Kilmarnock goalkeeper Ali Hunter, who would sign for Celtic just over 18 months later. Parkinson's report continued, "While Dalglish's performance was especially outstanding, another young player, Alistair Hunter, deserves great credit even though he lost 7 goals. Had it not been for a series of brilliant saves by the Kilmarnock goalkeeper, Celtic would have taken their total into double figures." Dalglish could be kept out of the team no longer, and over the course of 3 matches against Rangers at Ibrox between the 14th of August and 11th of September 1971, the young king would be crowned in spectacular style. Dalglish scored a barrel-load of goals in the pre-season friendlies and Dryborough Cup matches and was selected for the first competitive match of the season against Rangers. The match was played at Ibrox on the 14th of August 1971, but was officially a home match for Celtic. The main stand at Celtic Park was still undergoing reconstruction and the game could not be played there. After much wrangling and with Hampden unavailable, the Scottish Football League decided it should be played in Govan. Celtic lined up for the season opener: Williams, Craig, Hay, Murdoch, McNeil, Connolly, Johnston, Lennox, Dalglish, Callaghan, Hughes, sub, Davidson. It's interesting to note the inclusion of John Hughes for this match, despite his run-ins with Jock Stein towards the end of the previous season, and also the return of Bobby Murdoch, whose future had also been called into question. He turned in a vintage performance that had Jim Parkinson of the Glasgow Herald waxing lyrical in his report on the 16th of August. On his performance, Murdoch disproved the old axiom that they never come back. He has had his full share of injury and, more seriously, weight trouble, but he is in the team again, fitter than ever, and without having lost his immaculate passing skill. When he is directing the flow accurately, Celtic are at their peak, and this was how they secured the initiative in their League Cup section. Murdoch was ably supported in midfield by Tom Callaghan and Jimmy Johnston, playing a deep-lying role in the centre of the attack, and Jim Parkinson wrote, "At times David Hay and George Connolly, the pure essence of coolness, stepped out of the rear to lend extra firepower to the attack." Celtic won the match with 2 goals in 2 minutes in the second half. The first came from a corner kick taken by Bobby Lennox, the ball falling to Jimmy Johnston, who took a touch to kill the ball, then struck it high into the net through a ruck of players. 2 minutes later, John Hughes beat the Rangers offside trap and was through on goal before being hauled down by Peter McCloy. As the Celtic players looked at each other, wondering who should take the penalty, Billy McNeil handed the ball to 20-year-old Kenny Dalglish in front of the baying Rangers support behind the goal. Showing remarkable composure for one so young, Dalglish placed the ball before taking a few steps back. Before he began his run-up, he paused, tightened his shoelaces and placed the ball well away from McCloy to seal the win and the 2 sectional points. Celtic's advantage in the section was thrown away on the 25th of August when they were beaten 1-0 by Morton at Celtic Park. John Hughes had been an ever-present so far, but he injured his knee in this shock defeat, and when Celtic returned to Ibrox 3 days later for Rangers' official home game in the section, The match represented a glorious vindication of Stein's decision to move on some of the older players and replace them with the Colts chafing at the bit to take their places. Hughes was replaced by Lou Macari in a side now containing 4 Quality Street gang members, and they played a full part in a devastating 3-0 victory, which saw Rangers beaten and dejected long before the finish in front of their own fans, and left one European visitor raving about Celtic's performance. Jim Parkinson wrote in the Glasgow Herald of the 30th of August 1971, Jean Prouff, manager of Rennes, the French team who play Rangers in the European Cup Winners' Cup in a few weeks' time, is one of those characters wholly appreciative of the best in football. His trip to the Old Firm's second League Cup confrontation at Ibrox Stadium on Saturday was undertaken to assess his Scottish opponents, but he departed singing the praises of Celtic. Perhaps he had forgotten the exact nature of his mission, having become so enraptured with the Parkhead team's skills, the sort of display that prompted him to predict that they will be Europe's outstanding team this season. With their potent blend of youth and experience, Celtic were superior in every department, the Rangers' defence being unable to cope with a forward line described in the Scotsman of the 30th of August as the speedy Lennox, the persistent Macari and that old-fashioned youngster Dalglish. They were supplied with a steady stream of long, accurate passes from Bobby Murdoch and the strong, forceful running of Tom Callaghan. The orchestrator of the victory, though, was the imperious George Connolly, dictating play from the centre of defence. The Scotsman reported, "Deep in defence, the difference was clear. Beside the safe McNeil, Connolly played with a coolness and the construction of the old-fashioned inside forward. He was superb. McKinnon and Jackson were just as safe in defence, but no build-up flowed from them as it did from Connolly, who at times could be found upside with his strikers." The young Dalglish scored his second goal at Ibrox in a fortnight on 48 minutes, turning in a low cross from Bobby Lennox, who had been sent clear by a brilliant long pass from Bobby Murdoch. While Rangers had competed well in the first half, this knocked the stuffing out of them, and Tom Callaghan's volley from the edge of the box, which Jim Parkinson wrote in the Glasgow Herald will rank as one of the most spectacular for an Old Firm encounter, saw thousands streaming for the exits. Parkinson wrote, "Both sides had made substitutions because of injuries, Hood for Murdoch and Conn for McDonald, before Callaghan's goal, and there were vast spaces on the terracings at the Rangers' end before Lennox scored the third goal." Perhaps inevitably, Celtic's third visit to Ibrox that season produced a much closer and much more controversial match, but Celtic once again came out on top. There was only one change from the side that had won 3-0 in the second match, Jim Craig dropping out to be replaced by Jim Brogan, who played at left back, with Davy Hay going to right back. It looked like being another comfortable win for Celtic when Lou Macari headed them into the lead after only 8 minutes from a perfectly flighted Bobby Murdoch free kick. This time though, things didn't all go Celtic's way, and Willie Johnston equalised from the penalty spot after Jim Brogan was adjudged to have handled in the box. Right on half-time, Rangers took the lead after Evan Williams failed to hold a shot, dropping it at the feet of Colin Stein, who fired it home. Kenny Dalglish scored his third goal in 3 matches at Ibrox on 55 minutes, the Rangers' defence looking very suspect at a corner kick, Dalglish having time to control the ball and hit a left foot shot past McCloy from 12 yards. Alfie Conn was sent off for a second bookable offence on 70 minutes before Rangers had a goal disallowed when George Connolly's header to Evan Williams was a little short and the keeper hesitated in moving towards it. Jim Parkinson wrote in the Glasgow Herald of the 13th of September 1971, "My initial reaction was that it was a good goal, Stein managing to take advantage of hesitancy by Williams, raise a leg chest high and tap the ball over the goalkeeper into the net. Mr Patterson had other thoughts, dangerous play, and penalised the centre, who was indeed unlucky considering he did everything he could to play the ball. Williams hurt his arm in his late attempt to avert a goal, and the injury no doubt contributed to the terracing arguments." John Rafferty in the Scotsman that same day saw it differently. "Stein made contact with his right boot chest high and with all 6 studs showing. Almost every referee would have decided that this was dangerous play, but since what constitutes dangerous play is at the discretion of the referee, there is inevitably a big area for argument, and so the talk goes on. This decision was balanced out by a disallowed Celtic goal with the score at 1-0, Parkinson writing, "A Johnston goal that was disallowed for offside seemed a strange decision." The Celtic winner when it came was well deserved, and once again George Connolly and Tom Callaghan were instrumental in the victory. Parkinson reporting, "The smoother game was played by Celtic, who had two exceptional players in George Connolly and Callaghan. All the Parkhead team's attacking moves from defence radiate from Connolly, who could easily hit a fly on a wall from 50 or 60 yards, so accurate and precise is his passing. Callaghan, who eats up ground with that loping stride of his, is tremendously powerful and is not easily knocked off the ball in the hurly-burly of a tough match." The winner came in the final seconds of the match, and once again it was an embarrassment for the Rangers defence, with the smallest player on the pitch, Jimmy Johnston, out-jumping their defence to a high cross from Kenny Dalglish to loop a header over Peter McCloy. Closer the third game might have been, but Celtic's third Ibrox victory in a month seems to vindicate Jock Stein's decision to revamp his side 4 years after Lisbon. The football they were playing was at as high a standard as Stein's Celtic ever produced, and even allowing for the less fluent performance forced on them by a sturdy Rangers approach in the league match, they were clearly playing a sophisticated game that their rivals could not match. Rafferty concluded his report in The Scotsman, "The goals were indicative of the pattern. Celtic's 3 were well made, but Johnston scored from a penalty kick and Stein when Williams dropped the ball. Celtic were clearly the more constructive side, with Callaghan again fast and effective despite some knocks, and McNeil playing impressively with the cool and clever Connolly beside him." The Celtic team was evolving, and by the middle of September 1971 there was every indication that there was the potential there to at least equal the achievements of the Lisbon Lions over the next few years. If things had turned out differently, McGrain, Connolly, Hay, Dalglish and Macari could have provided the backbone of the side into the 1980s. It's against this backdrop that Jock Stein's decision to move on several of the Lions over the next few months should be considered. A few days before this third visit to Ibrox, Steve Chalmers was sold to Morton, where he took up the post of player coach and joined John Clark, who had signed for the Greenock club in the summer. Neither player had been a regular starter the previous season, and the time was probably right for Chalmers especially, now 35, to move on. Clark was only 30, but had lost his place in the team to Jim Brogan after picking up an injury in February 1968. By the beginning of 1971, Brogan was increasingly being played at left-back, with George Connolly alongside Billy McNeil in Clark's old role, and as good a player as Clark indisputably was, Connolly was special. The departures of Clark and Chalmers saw the 11 from Lisbon reduced to 7, and more would follow by the end of the year. The autumn of 1971 is the story of Jock Stein, John Hughes, Willie Wallace and Tommy Gemmell. Despite Celtic's smooth progress at the beginning of the season, it was an unhappy time for all of them. The month of September 1971 saw a loss to Celtic much more tragic than the departure of a player, and for Jock Stein personally, the loss of an invaluable ally and friend. Sir Robert Kelly was never universally loved by the Celtic support, but there's no denying he was a giant figure in the history not only of the club, but of Scottish football in general, running Celtic almost single-handedly from his election as chairman in 1947, and serving as president at different times of both the SFA and the Scottish Football League. A great deal of the blame for Celtic's years in the wilderness, from the end of the war until the return of Jock Stein in 1965, must be laid at Kelly's door. But his appointment of Jock Stein was a tacit, albeit belated admission that he needed to take a step back from the playing side of the club and allow a professional to take over. And without Robert Kelly, it's debatable if Jock Stein would ever have become Celtic manager at all. Stein's relationship with Kelly went back a long way, and the chairman had been one of the first to recognise the organisational and leadership qualities of the central defender signed from Llanelli in 1951. In Dreams and Songs to Sing, A New History of Celtic, Tom Campbell and Pat Woods write of Kelly's words after Stein captained Celtic to the League and Cup double in 1954. Little wonder then that at a presentation of medals to the Celtic players at Turnberry Hotel shortly afterwards, Chairman Bob Kelly's speech, which dutifully acknowledged the pieces of good fortune Celtic had enjoyed, singled out one player to illustrate the point. The luckiest was the day we signed our captain, Jock Stein. When Jock Stein was forced to retire from playing in 1958 due to the chronic ankle injury that left him with a limp for the rest of his life, Kelly put him in charge of the Celtic reserves with almost immediate success, and there he greatly influenced the development of a generation of players that included Bertie Auld, Billy McNeil, Steve Chalmers, John Hughes, Charlie Gallagher, and the eventually Manchester United-bound Pat Crerand. Forerunners of the Quality Street Gang, this talented bunch of youngsters who would form the core of the Lisbon Lions were known as the Kelly Kids, or more unkindly and inspired by the explosion of guitar pop bands in early 60s Britain, Bob Kelly and the Easy Beats. In a less enlightened time, Kelly did not see Stein as a future Celtic manager and had earmarked Sean Fallon as the long-term successor to Jimmy McGrory. It's no secret that the reason for this was that Jock Stein was not Catholic. Whether it was Bob Kelly's personal conviction that a non-Catholic could not manage Celtic, or if he only felt the support would not tolerate a non-Catholic manager, is a moot point, and Stein was allowed to leave to manage Dunfermline Athletic in 1960. What is not in dispute is that the two remained close, and Stein continued to view Kelly as a mentor figure even in his 5-year exile from Celtic. After establishing himself as the hottest managerial property in Scotland at Dunfermline, where he quickly made the previously undistinguished Provincials one of the top teams in the country, it was to Bob Kelly that Stein turned for advice when Hibernian approached him in 1964. Less than a year later, when he was offered the manager's job at Wolverhampton Wanderers, it was again Kelly's counsel he sought. At a fateful meeting in the North British Hotel in January 1965, the chairman decided, without consulting the rest of the board, to offer Stein the Celtic job. Stein only took the job on condition that he would be given full control of the playing side of the club, and for the next 5 years Bob Kelly gave him free rein. But there were forces on the board not entirely happy with this. Kelly had been in poor health for some time by 1971 and stepped down as chairman in April to be replaced by Desmond White, just as 57 years earlier, White's father Tom had replaced Kelly's father James. Robert Kelly became Celtic's honorary president on his retirement and died on the 21st of September 1971. Stein's relationship with the new chairman and the rest of the board was very different to that he had enjoyed with Kelly. Archie Macpherson writes in Jock Stein, the definitive biography, "The value of the relationship between the two men cannot be overestimated. With Sir Robert in the background, Stein had developed the confidence to embark on his self-determined path as manager. Now he was on his own. By that, I mean there were figures on the board who did not like Stein. With Sir Robert no longer there, they would not feel the same constraints being placed on them in terms of the way they regarded and discussed Stein." The way the rest of the board regarded Stein had been coloured by the events of the spring of 1971, when he had come very close to leaving Celtic to take up the manager's job at Manchester United. After initially stepping down as Manchester United manager in 1969, Matt Busby had returned to take up the reins again in December 1970, but only until a permanent appointment could be made. By March 1971, rumblings were beginning to be heard that Jock Stein was the man United wanted. David Meek wrote in the Manchester Evening News of the 8th of March 1971, "Will Jock Stein, manager of high-flying Glasgow Celtic, be the next team boss of Manchester United? It's denied in both Manchester and Glasgow. Rubbish, I know nothing about it," says Stein, as rumours build up in Scotland. United also stoutly maintained silence on the issue, beyond treating every inquiry with the comment that nothing has been decided and that an appointment will not be made until the close season. At the same time, it seems to me that Stein is the man emerging with the stature to follow Sir Matt, and who could possibly be tempted from his present job. He also seems to be about the one man who would instantly command respect at all levels of Old Trafford. Forthright contenders like Malcolm Allison and Brian Clough may not now be as acceptable in all corners of the Manchester club. Stein, at 48, is also younger than many estimate. He still works with the players as a tracksuit coach and, of course, has the background of experience and success needed for the job. After discussing Stein's qualities and achievements as a manager, Meek concluded, "It will be some time before the issue is resolved. For one thing, Stein is very much involved in the Championship again, as well as bidding for the European Cup. But opinion is hardening that Jock Stein is the man United will go for when the time is right." Stein was probably telling the truth when he said he knew nothing about any United approach at the beginning of March. But it seems clear he was very much aware by the evening of Celtic's European Cup match against Ajax on the 24th of March. United and former Celtic player Pat Crerand was at Hampden to watch the game, and he visited Stein's home later that night. Archie Macpherson quotes Crerand in Jock Stein, the definitive biography. "I went up to see the Ajax match at Hampden, where they won 1-0 but lost on aggregate. After it, I travelled out to Jock's house. He hadn't arrived back, but in the house were Jean, Bob Shankly and Tony Queen and their wives. When he did come back, I couldn't discuss the matter I really wanted to see him about because of the other folk being there. Eventually, Jock told me to go upstairs as his kids wanted to see me. His son George was there, on his own at first, and I thought it would be worthwhile letting the cat out of the bag to him, for I knew he loved United and adored Dennis Law. So I put it to him, how would you like your dad to go and join United as manager? He was over the moon. I could see the excitement in his face. Then his sister Ray came in, and when I put it to her as well, she was just as keen. But we were up there a little while and Jean came up to see what was going on, so I decided to let her in on it. I put it directly to her that United wanted Jock. What a different reaction. I could see right away this wasn't on as far as she was concerned. I love it here too much, and I love Celtic. There's no way I am going to Manchester." So there we were upstairs, talking about the big man's future, and he knew nothing about it. His kids and his wife were the first to hear that Matt wanted him at Old Trafford. Now, I knew that if Jock really wanted this job, he would go for it, despite what Jean thought. At least that's what I believed at the time. There's no doubt whatsoever that Jock Stein was very interested in taking the Manchester United job and held serious talks with them in April 1971. Pat Crerand, speaking to Archie Macpherson, continued, "He travelled down to meet Matt and Louis Edwards, the United chairman, in his house at Alderley Edge, where they laid out the terms and agreed another meeting, which the two of them thought was a formality. When Jock came down to see a first cup game between Liverpool and Leeds, he met up again with the United pair, and it is there the final talk took place. Matt always swore to me that at that meeting, Jock Stein shook his hand and agreed the deal, making him the next United manager. Matt went back, thinking another Lanarkshire man was going to take over. He was delighted. But only 24 hours later, a very angry Matt approached me and said, 'Some pal you've got, you wouldn't believe it. Jock's turned it down. He's just phoned me. He's not coming.' And I always remember he said, 'I think that man has just used me to get more money out of Celtic.' And it wasn't often you saw Matt being bitter about something, but that was the day." If Stein's second meeting with Busby and Edwards took place on the day of the Liverpool-Leeds First Cup tie, that would place it on the 14th of April 1971. If Stein called Busby 24 hours later, that would tie in perfectly with an exclusive report on the front page of the Evening Times of the 16th of April 1971, the day before Celtic's Crunch League match against Aberdeen at Pittodrie. John Quinn reported that day, "Jock Stein will still be the manager of Celtic FC next season. This is my firm conclusion after a series of investigations into the background of the Manchester United affair. It should be heartening news for the thousands of Celtic fans heading tonight and tomorrow for the slopes of Pittodrie, where Aberdeen and Celtic battle it out for supremacy in Scotland and a place among the elite in Europe next season. For some weeks now, the rumour has been gaining in momentum that the Celtic boss was about to cut the connections that have brought a glorious era to Celtic and Scottish football. The rumours had it that he was about to join Manchester United as a replacement for his fellow Lanarkshire man Sir Matt Busby. Today I can reveal that this is not so. Mr Stein will still be in control when August comes around. All sorts of rumours have been circulating. It has been said that Mr Stein has put his house up for sale in residential Kings Park, Glasgow, and that his business interests are being disposed of. The latest to add fire to the story is that his son George, a brilliant pupil at Glasgow High School, has applied to join Manchester University. But today I was told these rumours are ill-timed and blow this whole situation out of proportion. Just as he seemed on the verge of leaving, Stein had done a 180-degree turn and pledged his future to Celtic. Contrary to Busby's speculation, he didn't receive a wage rise for staying, and money had never been a factor in his interest in the United job. Probably the main reason for the manager staying at Celtic was the reluctance of Mrs Stein to move to Manchester. Archie Macpherson writes, "The rejection of the offer had principally been down to a wife who loved her home environment and would not budge. All the intimidatory powers Stein could bring into powerful effect in the outside world would vanish within the four walls of his home. However, also coming into play was his love of the Celtic supporters, whom he thought were the salt of the earth, and through that affection there was the constant thrum of duty and service to them still pounding in his mind. He was not going to sacrifice that, with so much more still to do." Fortunately, we'll never know how different the histories of Celtic and Manchester United would have been had Jock Stein moved south in 1971. But with the resources of Manchester United at his disposal, there's no telling how much he'd have won, both in England and in Europe, and it's almost a certainty more than a couple of Celtic players would have joined him at Old Trafford. Macpherson suggests that members of the board lost a certain amount of trust in Stein following his flirtation with Manchester United, and they were determined to reassert more control over the direction of the club following Kelly's death. In particular, Stein would never have the same relationship with the new chairman, Desmond White, that he had enjoyed with Kelly. Macpherson writes, "White and Stein enjoyed no form of constructive intimacy. The absence of the man who had made the final decision to bring him back as manager produced a painful autumn, aggravated by one of the biggest upsets in Scottish football history." That upset was the infamous League Cup final against Partick Thistle on the 23rd of October 1971. Aberdeen had maintained their form of the previous season and were 1 point ahead at the top of the league, with Celtic in second place after a shock 1-0 home loss to St Johnstone earlier in the month. But there had been nothing to suggest the match at Hampden would be anything other than a routine win for the champions, even allowing for Billy McNeil missing through injury. The team that took the field that fateful day was Evans, Hay, Gemmell, Murdoch, Connolly, Brogan, Johnston, Dalglish, Hood, Callaghan, Macari, sub, Craig. According to Archie Macpherson, the players were astonished by the team selection, with Bobby Lennox being left out and Jim Craig, who was not noted for playing anywhere other than right back, on the bench. This meant that if any substitution was required, the options would be limited. By the time Jimmy Johnston was injured and had to be replaced after only 20 minutes, Celtic were already, incredibly, 2 goals down. They became even more disjointed and conceded another 2 goals in the next 16 minutes. Macpherson writes, "At around 3:40 that afternoon, Frank Boff, in the BBC Grandstand studio in London, refused to read out the scoreline that was handed to him until it had been triple-checked, for he was being told that Celtic, after just 36 minutes play, were trailing 4-0. Things got no better in the second half, but the 4-1 defeat was an embarrassment more than anything else, and was the second of what would become 4 successive League Cup final losses. More significantly, 4 days before, John Hughes and Willie Wallace had been sold to Crystal Palace for a combined fee of just £50,000. That Tuesday afternoon, Celtic had been at Seamill preparing for their European Cup second round home tie against Sliema Wanderers of Malta, when a call had been received from London expressing interest in the pair. When this was followed up by their manager Bert Head and chairman Arthur Waite flying into Glasgow Airport, Jock Stein drove Wallace back to Glasgow. John Hughes had been left out of the squad, and after he was picked up from his home en route, they arrived at Celtic Park, and within the hour they were both reluctant Crystal Palace players. Wallace was by now 31 years old, and with the thrilling emergence of Kenny Dalglish and Lou Macari onto the scene, the time was arguably right for him to move on. But this is not so clear in the case of Hughes, still only 28 and a totally different type of player to the younger pair. Hughes was a player who hugely divided the support, perfectly fitting the old adage that some swore by him while others swore at him. While he did struggle for consistency throughout his career, there's no denying he was a terrific player and on his game could be unstoppable. A case could certainly be made that John Hughes still had a lot to offer Celtic, and while he always believed his fate was sealed by his extra time miss against Feyenoord, exactly when he fell out of favour is harder to pin down. He was still picked regularly at the beginning of season 1970-71 and scored the first goal in a 2-0 win over Rangers on the 12th of September 1970. Hughes himself pointed to a 3-2 defeat against St Johnstone at Muirton Park on the 6th of February 1971. Trailing 2-1 at the half-time whistle, with the defence looking very vulnerable under high balls and the midfield badly missing the injured Bobby Murdoch, Hughes was quoted by Archie Macpherson in Jock Stein, the definitive biography. "I think when I missed that chance against Feyenoord, my career was effectively over at Celtic Park. I don't think he ever forgave me for that. For instance, when I played against St Johnstone that year, I got a bad tackle which required 12 stitches in the front of my leg. He asked me if I was going out in the second half, and I protested that if I got another knock, it would burst open, so I didn't. We lost 3-2, and he blamed me directly for that." It hadn't been a good day for Hughes. Raymond Jacobs reported in the Glasgow Herald of the 8th of February 1971. "Before he retired at half-time, blood seeping from a gash on his left shin, Hughes had not been effective, and Chalmers, his replacement, fared little better." Just as in Milan though, it would have been harsh to blame Hughes for the defeat. The defence was unconvincing throughout and had conceded 3 goals from simple lobs into the box, while the midfield, minus Bobby Murdoch, who had dislocated his shoulder and would be out for 2 months, had never gotten a grip of the game. Fortunately for Celtic's championship challenge, Aberdeen slumped to a short 1-0 defeat against Dunfermline at East End Park that same afternoon. But for John Hughes, it signalled the beginning of a complete breakdown in his relationship with the manager. After being left out for the next month, he produced a letter asking for a transfer in the dressing room when he was left out yet again for the Scottish Cup tie against Raith Rovers on the 6th of March 1971. Jock Stein immediately accepted the request and sent him home, and he was not included in the party that travelled to Amsterdam in midweek for the first leg of the European Cup quarter-final against Ajax. Still without Bobby Murdoch, Celtic slumped to a 3-0 defeat after a tremendously disciplined defensive performance had stifled Ajax for the first hour, then conceded 2 late goals to leave them a mountain to climb in the return at Hampden. Even so, Hughes was restored to the team 3 days later and scored in league wins against Cowdenbeath and Kilmarnock. We can presume Jock Stein would have picked what he regarded as his strongest 11 for the return match against Ajax, and on the 24th of March, Hughes was again in the team that recorded a 1-0 win over the eventual tournament winners, but could not overcome the deficit from the first leg. He played and scored in the next game, a 4-0 league win against Falkirk, and only made his final appearance of the season in the Scottish Cup semi-final against Airdrieonians on the 3rd of April 1971. Despite the Rugby Park dressing room incident in May 1971, Hughes played in the early matches of season 1971-72, including in the 2-0 win at Ibrox, but was injured in the League Cup loss to Morton at Celtic Park and never regained his place. He made his last appearance for Celtic as a second-half substitute against B 1903 Copenhagen in the European Cup at Celtic Park on the 29th of September 1971. Even more so than Willie Wallace, John Hughes felt very bitter about the manner of his departure from Celtic, when he felt he should have been at the peak years of his career. In an interview with the Daily Record's Chris Roberts, published on the 9th of May 2014, he remembered, "I'm a Celtic guy and didn't want to leave Celtic. Ken Gallagher had asked me why I signed for Crystal Palace when Everton and Sheffield Wednesday were in for me as well, but I didn't know and Jock didn't tell me. I was negotiating with the Crystal Palace chairman and Jock came in and took me outside. He said, 'You get in there and effing sign or I'll sit you in the stand for 9 months.'" Hughes' autobiography paints a very unflattering picture of Jock Stein, and it must be remembered that he was by then not around to give his own version of any of the events as described by his former player. Probably the main criticism levelled at Stein as a manager was his seeming inability to sign a dependable goalkeeper. But another recurrent theme is the way he delivered bad news to players. Many over the years have expressed their bitterness at the manner in which he either dropped them or moved them on. The hard-bitten ex-miner did not go in for any sentimentality or displays of emotion. Archie Macpherson writes, "Stein was not at his best when handling players' departures from the club. In virtually all cases, there was a clumsiness involved that strongly suggested he preferred clinical splits and nothing more than that. He certainly had no time for the niceties and protocol of departures. If he shed tears at any time, it must have been in private. And if in the background to any change there was a long-term dispute with the manager, there was only ever going to be one winner." The other player in long-term dispute with the manager, Tommy Gemmell, would soon follow Hughes and Wallace out of the club. Gemmell's appearances in the team had become increasingly sporadic through the calendar year of 1971, and the player did not think the reason was entirely football-related. He remembers in Lionheart, written with Graham McCall, "Then, in the 1971-72 season, Jock started leaving me out quite frequently and playing the likes of Jim Brogan or Jimmy Quinn. I'm not really blowing my own trumpet in saying that I was a much better player than both of them. Jock had already disposed of a lot of first-team regulars between 1967 and 1970, and maybe it was his idea to start gradually rebuilding. I could understand that, but I couldn't understand why I might be regarded as past it. I was only 27 and had shown that I could still do it at European Cup level. Jock Stein would never offer any explanation as to why he was leaving me out. He would simply say on a Thursday, 'You'll be with the reserves this weekend.'" It does sound horribly big-headed of Gemmell, but in fairness, he really was that good. A few weeks before Celtic played Leeds in the 1970 European Cup semi-final, he was named in a European 11 chosen by a panel of European journalists and a World 11 picked by a panel of South American reporters. The defensive side of his game was occasionally suspect, but going forward, he was a force of nature, boundlessly energetic on the overlap and possessing one of the most powerful and accurate shots in the game. While Jim Brogan was a solid and dependable defender and was capped 4 times for Scotland in 1971, he was no Tommy Gemmell. In 4 European Cup semi-final matches in 1972 and 1974, Celtic failed to score a goal, and many times previously it had been Gemmell who broke the deadlock with his devastating shooting power. Gemmell's relationship with Jock Stein began to break down after the infamous Helmut Haller incident during a West Germany-Scotland World Cup qualifying match in October 1969, after which the player was dropped from the Celtic team for the League Cup final against St Johnstone and promptly handed in a transfer request. The request was accepted and Gemmell remained on the transfer list for the next 2 years. Relations were further frayed by Stein's insistence that no offers had been received for his services, despite Gemmell having had indications from intermediaries that there were interested parties. He writes in Lionheart, "I had decided the move was necessary as it had become clear that Jock Stein felt it was time for me to part company with Celtic. By that stage, I had grown very wary of his dishonesty and duplicity regarding potential moves during the time I was available for transfer." The League Cup final defeat to Partick Thistle, in which Gemmell deputised for Billy McNeill at centre-half, proved to be the last match he played for Celtic in Scotland. His final Celtic appearance came on a dusty pitch in Malta on the 3rd of November 1971 in a 2-1 win over Sliema Wanderers, which sealed a 7-1 aggregate win and took Celtic into the quarter-finals of the European Cup. 6 weeks later, Celtic accepted an offer of around £40,000 from Nottingham Forest, and he signed for them in the early hours of Friday the 17th of December. The Glasgow Herald of the 18th of December 1971 reported, "With the departure of Gemmell, whose experience at top level will be of great benefit to Forest as they try to stave off the threat of relegation, only 5 of Celtic's 1967 European Cup winning side remain at Parkhead: Jim Craig, Bobby Murdoch, Billy McNeil, Jimmy Johnston and Bobby Lennox." Gemmell left only reluctantly, writing in Lionheart, "I was sad to leave Celtic, but I realised it was not worth staying. Jock Stein had selected me for only 3 first-team league games that season, so it was clear I was no longer in his plans. I did not want to hang around simply to play in reserve football, especially when the people who had come into the team in my place were not, in my opinion, fit to lace my boots. I just wanted to get to a club where I would not be messed about." Again, it's important to remember that Jock Stein was not around to respond to any of these criticisms when Gemmell published his autobiography, or to present his side of the story. But it is hard to escape the conclusion that for both Tommy Gemmell and John Hughes, there was more to their departures than simply footballing considerations. Both were still only in their late 20s and should have been at the peaks of their careers. If either had been available for the European Cup semi-finals of 1972 and 1974, it isn't far-fetched to suggest, with their quality and experience, they might have made a difference to the outcomes. As 3 Celtic legends left the building in late 1971, the evolution of the team continued when Dixie Deans was brought in from Motherwell in a surprise and cut-price £17,500 deal. Deans was something of a controversial figure, with a reputation for disciplinary problems going back to December of 1966, when he was sent off at Celtic Park for what that day's Evening Times described as a foul on Johnston, while the Sunday Post the following day reported, "Deans got his marching orders for fouling Johnston, the 3rd incident the Well Centre had been involved in during the afternoon." In his biography, There's Only One Dixie Deans, written with Ken McNabb, Dixie remembered it slightly differently. "My first early bath happened during my debut season at Celtic Park, of all places. Wee Jimmy Johnston and I had an old-fashioned square go right in front of the old jungle. Not the best place to try and deck a Celtic hero, and more of this later. Referees are no different to anyone else. They all talk about football when they get together. I know the name Dixie Deans began to crop up more and more in conversations for all the wrong reasons." The transfer of Deans came in the wake of the League Cup final debacle against Partick Thistle, shortly after the departures of Hughes and Wallace, and provides an example of the sometimes murky transfer dealing between clubs in the days before freedom of contract. Serving a 6-week SFA suspension, Deans was approached by Daily Express journalist and friend of Jock Stein, Jim Rodger. In a cloak and dagger operation, Rodger had Deans driven out to the Carfin Grotto, as the player put it in his biography, not the kind of place I normally hung out away from Fir Park. And there Rodger told him he was to inform Motherwell manager Bobby Howett that he was quitting football altogether to emigrate to South Africa. All he would say to Deans at that point was that moves were afoot, but refused to give any details, telling the player to trust him. Suspecting a big move was in the offing, Deans did as Rodger said, and after he met with Howett, Jock Stein swung into action. Deans remembers in There's Only One Dixie Deans, "The story I heard later was that Jock got on the phone to Bobby Howett and said something along the following lines. I hear the boy Deans is leaving, that he's had enough of football. He's a bit of a handful, but we might be prepared to take a chance on him. We'll take him off your hands for, say, £17,500. What do you say?" 17 grand was a lot of money, but a good bit less than the 30,000 Motherwell were touting me for to other clubs a year or so back. Still, faced with watching that kind of money possibly going down the plug hole, Bobby had a decision to make. and it was a no-brainer. Deans was called into Fir Park on the 30th of October 1971, and after watching Motherwell lose 3-1 to Dundee, was driven by a friend to Celtic Park. Celtic had just beaten Ayr United 1-0 at Somerset Park, but Jock Stein had driven himself back to Glasgow ahead of the team bus and met Deans in the car park. Dixie remembered in There's Only One Dixie Deans. The first thing that struck me was how huge he was. I don't mean how tall he was, but he just seemed like a bear of a man. He had massive hands and he just seemed to give off this fantastic aura. We shook hands and frankly, he frightened me half to death. The negotiations, if that's what they could be called when Jock Stein conducted a transfer deal, concluded quickly, and Deans, who would not be able to play for almost a month due to his SFA suspension, travelled to Malta for what would be Tommy Gemmell's last match in the second round, second leg of the European Cup tie against Sliema Wanderers. Feeling wary about meeting his new teammates, it was his old sparring partner Jimmy Johnston who immediately made him feel at ease. He writes in There's Only One Dixie Deans. I was definitely an outsider, and that was the hardest part, trying to become one of the boys, as it were. Neil Mochan, the first team trainer, was the first to meet me at the airport and quickly ushered me over to where the rest of the squad were waiting to check in. Since I was serving a 6-week SFA ban, I was only going to Malta for the ride and to get to know my new teammates. I remember there were a few murmured hellos and low-key handshakes, but all that changed when we went through to the departure lounge. As usual, it was Jinky, still seemingly nursing a grudge from our handbags Barney in front of the jungle, who broke the ice. Don't think I've forgotten you tried to do me 5 years ago. It wasn't the opening words I had expected, but then the wee man's face cracked into a giant grin and everyone laughed. Soon I was the butt of everyone's banter, and that's the way it is at every club. Having been signed partly as a response to the League Cup final defeat at the hands of Partick Thistle, Dixie Deans made his debut for Celtic at Firhill in the next meeting of the clubs on the 27th of November 1971. He scored in the 86th minute to seal a 5-1 win for his new club and exact a measure of revenge for the Hampden humiliation. The evolution of the side continued, with Kenny Dalglish dropping back into midfield to enable a new forward pairing of Deans and Lou Macari. The Glasgow Herald reported on the 29th of November 1971, "The crest of the wave, so to speak, consisted of Macari and Deans. That Macari should be the only Celtic forward not to score was hardly justice, for this courageous, skilled and endlessly energetic player otherwise emerged as the game's outstanding character." Afterwards, Jock Stein expressed himself as being well satisfied with Deans' performance in his first senior appearance for the club, and these two small men should eventually thoroughly complement each other to become big thorns in the sides of opposing defences. Victory at Firhill took Celtic back to the top of the league, with Aberdeen losing at home to Hearts, and the League Cup final was looking increasingly like no more than a bump in the road, as Stein's new-look side moved smoothly through the gears. Deans scored 5 goals in the next 4 matches, as full points were taken from a run that included 2 more 5-goal performances at home to Kilmarnock and away to Motherwell. Aberdeen were still on their heels, but a 3-2 win over Hearts at home on Christmas Day saw Celtic top of the league at the end of the year and firm favourites to win a record-breaking 7th successive league title. Even more importantly, a European Cup quarter-final tie against the dangerous Hungarians of Újpest Dósa awaited, and it was in the first leg in Hungary that the Quality Street gang gave the first sign of fulfilling their awesome potential. But as hopes of a third European Cup final appearance soared, a brilliant quarter-final victory was quickly followed by the first sign that Celtic's 1970s would be dogged by bad fortune, and that maybe some of the Lisbon Lions really had gone too soon.